The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and by the time Rebecca Hale realized she had written the wrong name on the mail-order bride form, the stagecoach was already pulling away from the Kansas City depot with her trunk strapped to its roof. She sat inside the rocking coach with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the wind pressing dust against the small windows, and she stared at the copy she had kept of her application form. There, in her own careful handwriting, in the line marked applicant full name, she had written her sister's name. Clara Hale, not Rebecca. Clara. It had been an accident born of exhaustion and heartbreak. 3 weeks before, Rebecca had sat at the kitchen table of her aunt's narrow house in Kansas City, filling out the form by candlelight after a long day of taking in laundry. Her younger sister Clara had been sitting across from her, chattering about a young man she had met at a church social, going on and on about how wonderful it was to be in love, and Rebecca had been only half listening, dipping her pen, writing the lines of the form one by one, and somewhere in the middle of that candle-lit distraction, her pen had carried Clara's name onto the page. She had not noticed. She had been too tired. She had blotted the ink, folded the paper, sealed it into an envelope, and sent it off to the matrimonial agency the very next morning before the sun had fully risen. 3 weeks later came the reply. A Mr. Lionel Merritt of Harlow Creek, Texas, had accepted the correspondence and enclosed a modest but carefully written letter introducing himself, describing his ranch, and stating that he looked forward to receiving Miss Clara Hale as his bride. And here was the problem that sat heavily in Rebecca's chest as the stagecoach lurched through the dry Texas landscape. She was not Clara. She was 24 years old, 2 years older than her sister, with dark brown hair where Clara had fair, with green eyes where Clara had blue, with a practical disposition where Clara had charm. Clara had not even known the form had been submitted in her name. Clara was, by now, engaged to that young man from the church social and happily planning a spring wedding in Kansas City. Rebecca had 2 choices when the letter arrived. She could write back to this Mr. Lionel Merritt, confess the mistake, apologize, and let the arrangement dissolve before it had truly begun. Or she could go. She had chosen to go. She told herself it was because she had spent 6 years caring for her ailing mother, and when her mother passed in February, she had found herself utterly without anchor. She told herself it was because Kansas City held nothing for her now but a small room in her aunt's house and the endless smell of other people's laundry. She told herself that any start was better than no start, that Texas was wide and open and far from everything that made her feel small. But she also knew, in the honest, quiet corner of her heart, that she had been terribly lonely for a very long time, and the idea that somewhere out there a man had agreed to meet a woman with the intention of building a life together felt like something she was not willing to let go, even if the name on the form was wrong. She had, however, made herself one promise on that stagecoach. She would be honest. She would arrive. She would introduce herself by her real name. She would tell Mr. Lionel Merritt the truth about the mistake, and she would accept whatever followed, even if it meant turning right around and taking the next coach back north. The town of Harlow Creek appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, then slowly as a collection of low wooden buildings rising from the flat Texas scrubland, their facades bleached pale by the relentless sun. The stagecoach rolled down the main street with considerable noise and a cloud of red dust, and Rebecca pressed her face to the window and watched the town materialize around her. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a small church with a crooked steeple, a livery stable, a saloon with its doors swinging open even in the midday heat, and a scattering of men and women going about their ordinary business. She had been told in Mr. Merritt's letter that he would meet her at the stage stop. The coach shuddered to a halt, and she gathered her small traveling bag and stepped down into the Texas afternoon. The sun was enormous and merciless. The air smelled of horse and dust and something faintly like cedar. She stood on the packed earth of the street and looked around her. He was standing near the front of the general store, leaning against the hitching post with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, capable build that came from years of ranch work rather than any particular vanity. He wore dark trousers, worn leather boots, a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a wide-brimmed hat that threw his face into partial shadow. He was perhaps 30, though the Texas sun made a man look his age in ways that indoor living did not, and she could not be certain. His face was angular and honest, with a jaw carrying a few days of stubble and eyes that she would later decide were the precise color of faded denim, that particular blue-gray that was not quite one thing or the other. He was watching the stagecoach. He was watching her step down. And as she stood there with her bag in one hand and her heart doing something complicated in her chest, he pushed off the hitching post and walked toward her with a direct, unhurried stride. "Miss Hale," he said, and his voice was low and steady with the particular cadence of a man who did not waste words. Rebecca took a breath. This was the moment. "Yes," she said, "though I should tell you right away that my name is Rebecca Hale, not Clara. Clara is my younger sister. I made a mistake on the form. I wrote her name instead of my own, and I did not notice until it was too late to stop the correspondence. I am very sorry for the confusion. I understand entirely if you would like me to take the next stage back north." She watched his face carefully through all of this. He did not frown. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, surprised, but it was a contained surprise, the kind that a careful person processes quietly rather than loudly. He was quiet for a moment. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his dark hair, and put it back on. "Rebecca," he said slowly, as though testing the name. "Yes. You came all this way knowing the form had the wrong name on it." "I did." "Why?" She had prepared a polished answer for this. She had rehearsed it on the stagecoach, something dignified and measured about seeking a fresh start in a new territory. But standing here in the enormous Texas sun with this man's direct blue-gray eyes on her, the rehearsed answer dissolved, and the honest one came out instead. "Because I did not want to stay where I was," she said, "and because it seemed wrong to simply let the whole arrangement fall apart over a name when the intent behind it was genuine." He was quiet again. Somewhere down the street, a horse snorted. The swinging doors of the saloon exhaled a burst of loud voices and then fell silent again. "The agency is going to want their fee back," he said at last. "I would expect so." He looked at her for another long moment, the way a man looks at something he is trying to honestly assess, without flattery and without dismissal. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one. "You might as well come see the ranch before you decide anything," he said. "You've ridden a long way. Least I can do is offer you a meal." It was not stay. It was not a declaration or a warm welcome or anything like what she might have hoped for in a less cautious fantasy. But it was not a rejection either, and she recognized it for what it was, a careful man leaving a door open. She picked up her traveling bag. "Thank you," she said. His wagon was around the corner at the livery, a plain but solid buckboard with a bay horse that regarded her with the serene disinterest of an animal that had seen everything. Lionel loaded her trunk with efficient care and helped her up onto the seat with a brief, firm hand that he removed the moment she was settled, as though he was conscious of the fact that they were strangers and intended to remain respectful of it. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour, through country that opened up wide and enormous around them, the scrubland giving way to longer grass as they moved south, with the occasional stand of mesquite and live oak throwing thin shade over the pale earth. Rebecca had grown up in Missouri and spent her adult years in Kansas City, and she had no frame of reference for this kind of landscape. It was not beautiful the way she had been taught to recognize beauty. There were no soft green hills here, no flowering meadows, no comfortable sense of enclosure. But it was striking in its own austere way, the vast flat horizon, the enormous sky with its mountains of cloud, the sense of space so absolute it was almost vertiginous. Lionel drove with the easy competence of someone who had made this particular trip so many times, it required no conscious thought. For the first several minutes neither of them spoke, and it was not an uncomfortable silence precisely, but it had weight. Then he said, "How old are you?" 24, she said. "You?" 29, she nodded. 5 years was a reasonable distance. She had been prepared for worse. "You said you wanted a fresh start," he said. "What were you leaving behind?" She told him in the brief, factual way she had of speaking about things that hurt. Her mother's long illness, the years of caregiving, the small room in her aunt's house, the laundry work. She did not make it dramatic. She simply described it the way you might describe weather. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My father died 2 years ago, left me the ranch. It's been just me and the hands ever since." "Is it a working ranch?" "Cattle, mostly. Got a small herd, about 200 head, some horses. The land is good if you know what to do with it." "Do you know what to do with it?" Something about that question seemed to catch him sideways. He glanced at her, and she thought she saw amusement in his expression, though it was brief and controlled. "I think so," he said, "most days." The ranch house came into view as they crested a low rise, and it was not what she had imagined, neither the grand establishment of a prosperous rancher, nor the mean shack of a man barely getting by. It sat in a broad clearing surrounded by a fence of rough-cut cedar posts, a main house of weathered timber, 2 stories, with a covered porch running its full width along the front. Behind it were a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a garden plot that needed work, and several outbuildings in varying states of repair. 2 horses grazed in a small paddock to one side. A ranch hand, she would later learn, was named Pete, was mending fence on the far side of the yard and lifted his hat to them as they pulled in. "It needs a woman's eye," Lionel said as he stopped the wagon, and then immediately seemed to realize how that might sound, because he added, "I don't mean that to be presumptuous. I only mean it's been maintained by men who think of practical things and not much else." "I understand what you mean," she said. He helped her down, and she stood in the yard and looked at the house and felt something stir in her that she could not immediately name. It was not love, not yet, not after 1 hour and a wagon ride. But it was something. A recognition, perhaps, or a sense of possibility pressing against the inside of her chest. He showed her inside, and she walked through the rooms with careful attention. The main floor held a large kitchen with a good iron stove, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and a small study off the hallway crowded with ledgers and papers. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. He showed her to the largest of the guest rooms, plainly furnished but clean enough, with a window that looked out over the yard and the open range beyond. "You can stay here," he said, standing in the doorway, "for now, while you decide." "That is very kind of you," she said. "I want to be clear that I do not expect anything from you, Mr. Merritt. The arrangement was made under a false name. I do not hold you to any of it." "Lionel," he said. She looked at him. "You can call me Lionel," he said. "If you're going to be staying, even just for a few days, Mr. Merritt is too formal." "All right," she said. "Lionel." He nodded once, as though something had been settled, and went back downstairs to see to the horse. That evening she cooked dinner because it seemed the natural thing to do, and because she was a woman who understood that in strange circumstances the best thing was to be useful. She found the kitchen reasonably stocked, flour and salt pork and dried beans and cornmeal and a side of smoked bacon, and she made a proper supper of cornbread and beans and bacon, with the last of what turned out to be a very good collection of dried herbs she found in a tin near the stove. When Lionel came in from the barn and sat down at the kitchen table and tasted the food, she watched his expression carefully. He looked surprised, in that same contained way, and then simply pleased. "This is good," he said, and it was not flattery. It was an honest statement delivered as simply as everything else he said. "Thank you," she said, and sat down across from him. They ate together in the lamplight of the kitchen, and gradually a conversation unfolded between them, quiet and careful at first, testing the edges of things, and then, as the meal went on, more natural. She asked him about the cattle operation, and he explained it with real knowledge and a kind of quiet pride that she found appealing. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father who had died when she was 12 and her mother who had held everything together afterward with sheer stubborn determination, and about Clara, who was the one in the family who could charm anyone in 3 minutes and break their heart in 4. He laughed at that, a genuine laugh, brief and surprised, and she felt something warm settle in the room between them. "She sounds like trouble," he said. "She is the best kind of trouble," Rebecca said. "She is happy. I have always been grateful for that, even when it made me feel like I was standing outside a warm window looking in." The honesty of it surprised even her. She had not intended to say something so naked, but Lionel did not look uncomfortable. He looked at her steadily across the table and said, "I know that feeling." She wanted to ask him what he meant, but something in his expression suggested it was early for that particular door, and she respected it. After supper she washed the dishes in the basin and he dried them, which she had not expected, and they worked side by side in the small kitchen in the lamplight, and it was perhaps the most domestic and comfortable thing she had done in years, standing close to another person with their elbows nearly touching and the warm smell of soapy water between them. She wrote a letter to Clara that night, explaining everything. She was not certain what Clara would say, but she owed her the truth. She set the letter on the writing desk in her room to be sent with the next post and lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the enormous Texas silence, which was not truly silent at all but full of insects and wind and the distant sound of cattle, and thought that she had perhaps done the strangest and most impulsive thing of her life, and that she was not, at the moment, sorry. The days that followed were a careful, tentative negotiation between two people who were strangers trying to become something else, without either of them being certain what that something was. Rebecca established herself in the kitchen and garden with characteristic efficiency. The garden had been badly neglected, and she began clearing it by the second morning, pulling weeds and turning soil in the early hours before the heat became oppressive. She found a kind of meditative satisfaction in it, the physical reality of the earth and the quiet before the ranch fully woke up, and she discovered that she could see Lionel from where she knelt by the garden, moving between the barn and the paddock in those early hours, working with his horses with a focused patience that she found herself watching more often than was strictly necessary. He was, she decided, a man of genuine competence. She saw it in everything he did, in the way he worked with the horses without force but with a calm authority they seemed to trust, in the way he spoke with his ranch hands, a group of 4 men that included Pete and a young Mexican cowboy named Marcos and 2 brothers from East Texas whose names were Floyd and Curtis. He was not cold with them, but he was not easy either. He was clear and fair, and they worked well for him. On the 3rd day he stopped by the garden on his way back from the paddock and looked at the work she had done. "You don't have to do all this," he said. "I know that," she said. "I want to. It is useful work." He looked at the cleared rows and the turned earth and after a moment said, "What do you want to plant?" "Beans," she said. "Tomatoes if you have seed, squash, some herbs. Do you have a root cellar? Behind the smokehouse." "Good, then we can put up winter stores." He was quiet, but she had come to understand that his silences were not absence. He was listening, processing. After a moment he said, "I'll see if Marcos knows where to get seed in town." She looked up at him from where she was kneeling, and the sun was behind him, and she had to shield her eyes with her hand to see his face. He looked down at her with that same careful, measuring expression she had seen at the stage stop, and she felt the warmth of it, not quite a smile but something that functioned the same way. "Lionel," she said. "Yeah. I like it here," she said simply. "I just thought you should know that." Something shifted in his face, subtle as the change in light when a cloud moves. "I'm glad," he said and walked on toward the house. Clara's letter arrived 8 days after Rebecca had sent hers, which was remarkably fast given the distance and the occasional unreliability of the mail in that part of Texas. Rebecca read it at the kitchen table while Lionel was out with the herd, and she read it 3 times. Clara had not been angry. Clara was, to Rebecca's overwhelming relief, characteristically warm and characteristically direct. The letter said, "Rebecca, you impossible, wonderful person. You have always been the brave one even when you did not know it. Tell me everything about this man and this ranch and whether he is kind. That is the only thing that matters. I am happy here with Thomas, and I hope you will be just as happy there, under your own name this time." Rebecca folded the letter carefully and pressed her fingers against its surface and felt the sharp sweetness of being loved by the person you loved best, the particular ache of a sister's grace. She was still sitting there when Lionel came in through the back door, dusty and wind-smelled and already pulling his hat off, and he saw her expression and stopped. "Good news or bad?" he asked. "My sister is not angry with me," she said. "Were you worried she would be?" "I thought she might be. I used her name without her knowledge." He poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher on the counter and leaned against the kitchen doorframe. "Sounds like she understands you," he said. "She always has," Rebecca said, "better than anyone." He was quiet and then he said, "You can write to her as often as you like. If you need paper or envelopes, there's a supply in the study." It was a small thing. It was a very small and ordinary thing. But it meant, she understood, that he was thinking about what she needed, about her comfort and her connections, about the shape of her life, and not only the function she might serve in his. And it moved her considerably more than she would have been able to explain to anyone who had not spent years feeling like an afterthought. "Thank you," she said, and her voice carried more warmth than she had intended, and she saw him register it, a brief attentiveness that came and went in his expression like a passing light. On the 10th day, there was trouble with the cattle. A section of fence on the south boundary had been cut, not broken by weather or wear but deliberately cut, and 20 head had wandered through onto the open range. Lionel rode out at first light with Marcos and Floyd, and Rebecca learned about it when Pete came to the kitchen door to tell her they might be late back and not to worry if supper got cold. She spent the morning working in the garden and the afternoon doing the household mending that had accumulated in a basket near the sitting room, and she was aware that she was listening for hoofbeats in a way that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with the particular unease of caring about someone's safe return. They came back in the late afternoon, all three of them, dusty and tired, with the cattle accounted for, and a grim set to Lionel's jaw that she had not seen before. "Same man," Pete muttered to her at the kitchen door while Lionel was putting up his horse, and she looked at him questioningly. "Fellow named Garrett," Pete said, lowering his voice. "Harlan Garrett. He's got land east of here and he's had his eye on acquiring more of it for about 2 years now. Cuts fences, drives off cattle, makes offers that are really more like threats. He's already pushed the Alvarez family off their property down near the creek last autumn. We think he's angling to do the same to Mr. Merritt." Rebecca absorbed this. "Has Mr. Merritt gone to the law?" Pete made a face that said a great deal without any words. "Sheriff's office is in Carlisle, which is 30 miles east, and Garrett's got friends in Carlisle if you take my meaning." She took his meaning very clearly. At supper she put a better meal than usual on the table, because she understood that there was nothing she could do about Harlan Garrett and the cut fence, but she could make sure that the men sitting at the table ate well and felt, for the duration of a meal at least, that home was worth coming back to. She made a proper stew from the remaining salt pork and the first beans she had harvested from the newly restored garden, with cornbread and the preserved apple butter she had found in the root cellar. Lionel ate quietly and the men around the table were subdued, but the food was good, and after a while the mood lifted a little, and Floyd told a story about a mule he had known in East Texas that made Curtis laugh so hard he nearly upset his water glass, and some of the tension went out of the evening. After the hands went to the bunkhouse and she and Lionel were alone in the kitchen, she asked him directly. "Pete told me about Garrett," she said, stacking the dishes. He was at the table still, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Pete talks too much," he said, but without real heat. "Is it serious?" A pause. "Could get that way," he said. "Garrett's been patient about it." He's smart enough not to do anything that would bring the law down on him clearly, but he's been building pressure for a while now. What will you do? He looked at her across the kitchen with that steady, direct gaze of his. Hold the line, he said simply. This is my father's land, my land now. I'm not going anywhere. She believed him completely. There was no bravado in it, no performance. It was simply a statement of fact from a man who had already made his decision and did not need to dramatize it. Then I will hold it with you, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, You don't have to do that. I know I don't, she said, which was the same thing she had said to him about the garden, and she saw from his expression that he remembered it. Something changed between them that evening, not in any dramatic or declared way, but in the subtle, real way that things change between two people when they have revealed something true to each other. They moved differently around the kitchen, with less careful distance, less deliberate avoidance of proximity. When she handed him the dry dish to put away and their hands were close for a moment, neither of them moved away quickly. She went upstairs to her room and lay in the dark and thought that she was in very serious trouble, the good kind. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival. She began to settle into the rhythms of the ranch with a naturalness that surprised her, as though some part of her had always been meant for this landscape, this life. She rose with the sun and tended the kitchen and the garden through the morning, and in the afternoon she explored the property on foot, learning its borders and its textures. She found a creek to the west of the main pasture, shallow and clear and lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves shimmered silver in the afternoon breeze. And she took to spending an hour there in the late afternoon, sitting on the bank with her boots off and her feet in the cool water, and the enormous Texas sky reflected in the surface around her ankles. Lionel found her there one evening when he had come looking for a stray calf that had taken to wandering toward the creek, and he stopped when he saw her, and then, after a moment's hesitation, sat down on the bank a few feet away and took his own boots off and put his feet in the water, and they sat like that for a while without speaking, listening to the water and the wind and the distant cattle. My father used to come here, he said eventually. I can see why, she said. I haven't been here since he died, he said. Too much to do, I told myself. Truth is I didn't want to come alone. She absorbed the weight of that. You're not alone now, she said carefully. He looked over at her, and the afternoon light on the water was doing something golden and generous to the landscape, and she was suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting, close enough that she could see the particular texture of the skin at his temple, and the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck where the hat had been pressing it all day. No, he said quietly, I'm not. It was not the moment for more than that. She understood that. Lionel was not a man who moved fast toward the important things, and she had found, somewhat to her surprise, that she respected that in him. She was not a fast-moving woman herself. She had spent too many years being careful, too many years managing things one step at a time, to find recklessness appealing. What she found appealing was exactly this: a man who thought before he spoke and felt before he declared and chose things deliberately. They walked back to the house together in the long evening light, carrying their boots, walking on the warm grass, and the conversation that happened on that walk was about small and ordinary things: the condition of the west fence, whether to plant a second variety of bean, what Marcos thought the weather was going to do. But underneath it ran something bright and warm that neither of them named yet, because naming it too early would have been like opening a window before a room was warm. The trouble with Harlan Garrett escalated in a way that was calculated to be impossible to prove. 2 of the water troughs in the south pasture were found fouled, the water brackish and dark and clearly unfit for the cattle. A section of the haystack in the barn had been moved so that rain had gotten into it and begun to rot the winter supply. A note appeared on the fence post at the edge of the property, unsigned, that said simply, "Get out while the getting is good." Lionel rode into Harlow Creek and spoke with the local justice of the peace, a man named Aldridge, who listened carefully, and then said what Pete had essentially predicted, which was that without clear evidence of who had done these things, there was very little that could be done. Harlan Garrett was a man with money and connections and a lawyer in Carlisle, and the West Texas law moved slowly against men of that description. Lionel came home from that meeting with a quietness that was different from his usual quietness. This one had an edge in it, a controlled frustration that he was working hard not to let spill outward. Rebecca had learned, in the weeks of living alongside him, to read his silences as carefully as she read his words. She set a cup of coffee on the desk in the study where he was sitting with his ledgers and said nothing about Garrett or Aldridge or any of it. She simply put the coffee down and started to leave, and he said, "Rebecca." She turned. "Thank you," he said, and he meant all of it, not just the coffee, and she could hear that. "We'll think of something," she said. "Between us." He nodded once, and she went back to the kitchen, and that night after supper she sat with him at the study desk and they went through the ranch records together, looking at the patterns of the disruptions, the timing of them, the geography. It was Rebecca who noticed that everything Garrett had done was on the south and east sides of the property, which were the sides closest to the land he already owned. "He wants the creek," she said, pointing at the rough map Lionel had sketched in the margin of his ledger. "Your west pasture runs to that creek. The creek is the water source for both properties, but it originates on yours. If he gets your land, he controls the water for miles." Lionel was very still for a moment. Then he said, "That's exactly right. I should have seen that." "You've been too busy managing the damage to look at the shape of it," she said, not unkindly. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something undisguised and direct, a kind of frank appreciation that went past ordinary gratitude into something warmer and more personal. She felt it as clearly as she felt the lamplight on her face. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You expected Clara," she said. "I expected a wife," he said quietly. "I did not expect a partner." The word hung between them in the lamplight, warm and weighted with meaning that neither of them was quite ready to unpack all the way. Rebecca looked down at the ledger under her hands and drew a slow breath. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about what comes next, for me. About whether I should stay beyond a reasonable visit or whether I should find a way to make proper arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" he asked, and his voice was very level in the way it got when he was being deliberate. "I could find work in town," she said. "The general store looked as though it could use help. I could support myself and find somewhere to board while I decide on next steps. I do not want to stay here under false pretenses, Lionel. I came with a form that had the wrong name and a story that does not match the agency's records, and while I am grateful that you have been generous, I am aware that the situation is irregular." "Irregular," he said, and she heard something in his voice that might have been the beginning of amusement, though his expression was still serious. "You've been here a month and you've reorganized the kitchen, saved the garden, identified Garrett's strategy better than I managed in 2 years, and you want to go board in town." "I want to do what is right," she said. "Then stay," he said. She looked up at him. "Stay," he said again, and this time it was not casual or offhand but completely deliberate, each word placed with care. "Not because of the agency or the form or any arrangement. Stay because you want to and because I want you here." She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from the hallway. Outside, a nighthawk called its strange, buzzing cry from somewhere in the dark. "You should know what you are asking," she said. "I am not easy company. I am direct and I am stubborn and I have very particular opinions about the correct way to do most things, and I have been told that I am not warm enough or soft enough or pleasing enough in the ways that men generally prefer." "Who told you that?" he asked, and there was something sharp in his voice, not anger but a kind of protective directness. "Various people over the years," she said carefully. "They were wrong," he said, with the flat certainty of a man stating a fact about the weather. She looked at him for a long time across the lamplight and the ledger and the sketched map that showed his land and his creek and the shape of his future, and she thought about the wrong name on a form and the stagecoach and the enormous sky and the creek with the silver cottonwoods, and she thought that whatever had brought her here, accident or loneliness or the particular grace of a mistake made in candlelight, she was not sorry. She was not sorry at all. "All right," she said. "I will stay." The seasons of a Texas summer unfolded around them, and what grew between Lionel and Rebecca grew the same way the garden did, slowly at first, then with a sudden abundance that seemed to arrive all at once and fill every available space. He began to seek her company in small, deliberate ways. He would find reasons to be near the garden when she was working it, asking questions about the plants that she suspected he already knew the answers to, or stopping near the kitchen window when he was working on the equipment, so that their voices could carry through the open window, ordinary conversation about the day's work, about the cattle prices at the Carlisle market, about what she had heard from Clara in the latest letter. She, in return, learned the particular language of his attentions. The way he always made sure her coffee was fresh before his own. The way he would notice, without comment, when she was tired and would take some task off her hands without making a point of it. The way he listened to her speak, with his full attention, none of it distributed to other things, all of it on her face and her words. One evening in late June, he brought her a book he had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, a collection of botanical illustrations, because she had mentioned once in passing that she had always wanted to learn more about the plants of the region. He set it on the kitchen table next to her coffee cup with no ceremony whatsoever, just put it there and sat down across from her, and she looked at it and then at him, and the simplicity of the gesture undid her completely. She was not a woman given to easy tears. She had cried exactly twice since her mother's death, once at the funeral and once on the stagecoach when she had not been sure she was doing the right thing coming to Texas. She did not cry now, but she felt it somewhere behind her eyes, the warm pressure of being known, of having a passing sentence taken seriously enough to be acted upon weeks later. "Lionel," she said. "I wasn't sure if it was the right kind," he said quickly, with the slightly uncertain air of a man who had thought about this more than he was comfortable admitting. "There might be better ones." "It is exactly the right kind," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, satisfied, and picked up his coffee, and she opened the book on the table between them and they looked at it together, their heads almost close enough to touch, with the evening light coming gold through the kitchen window. It was Marcos who mentioned to her, with the particular directness of a young man who had decided something needed to be said, that he had never seen Lionel Merritt look at anyone the way he looked at her. They were in the yard one morning while she was hanging laundry and he was mending a bridle on the fence post, and he said it without preamble, in his straightforward way that she had always liked. "He is a good man," Marcos added. Sometimes good men need someone to tell them it is all right to want things. She thought about this for a long time. The matter of Harlan Garrett came to a resolution that was not dramatic in the way of dime novels but was, in its way, decisive. It was Rebecca's idea, developed over several evenings of conversation with Lionel at the study desk, to go over the head of the Carlisle Sheriff's Office and write a formal complaint to the Texas Rangers, detailing the pattern of deliberate interference with the ranch's operations. She wrote the letter herself because she had a clear head and good prose, and she included the map she had drawn, showing the geographical concentration of Garrett's interference and the obvious water rights motivation behind it. Lionel reviewed it, changed 2 things, and sent it with a rider to San Antonio. 6 weeks later, 2 rangers arrived in Harlow Creek. They were weathered, quiet, professional men who went about their investigation without making a show of it, speaking to a number of people in the county, examining the evidence that had been preserved, and making certain inquiries in Carlisle that Harlan Garrett's friends were not able to obstruct. The result, after several weeks more, was a formal warning delivered to Garrett's property and the clear understanding that further interference with neighboring ranches would result in criminal prosecution. Garrett did not fold overnight. He was too proud and too stubborn for that. But the harassment stopped. The water troughs were left alone. The fence was left intact. And word got around the county, in the way that word does in a place where people pay attention, that the Merritt Ranch had stood its ground and won. Pete told Rebecca this with great satisfaction one morning over coffee, and she felt a deep and private pleasure at it that she did not particularly need anyone else to know about. It was a Sunday morning in mid-July when Lionel finally did what she had been quietly waiting for him to do. She was on the porch in the early morning, before the heat settled, with her botanical book and a cup of coffee, and he came out of the house and sat down in the other chair. And for a while they simply existed in the morning together, which was itself a thing she had come to love, this easy inhabiting of the same space without need for constant conversation. Then he said without preamble, "I've been thinking about what I want to ask you." She looked at him. "I've been careful about it," he said, "because I didn't want to rush you. You came here under complicated circumstances and I wanted you to have time to know your own mind about things. But I've known my own mind for a while now, and I think it's not fair to keep it to myself." "Go ahead," she said softly. He looked at her steadily, the way he always did when he was saying something that mattered. "I don't care what name was on that form," he said. "I care about you. Rebecca Hale, the woman who came off that stagecoach and told me the truth before I'd even offered her a hand up. The woman who looked at my rundown garden and decided to fix it without being asked. The woman who sat in my dead father's favorite spot by the creek and made it feel like a place worth going to again." He paused. "I want to marry you if you'll have me. Not because of any arrangement, because it's what I want more than I've wanted anything in a long time." The morning was very quiet around them, the insects loud in the grass, a meadowlark somewhere near the fence, the sun climbing slowly in the enormous Texas sky. Rebecca set down her coffee cup on the porch railing and looked at this man who had been a stranger to her 8 weeks ago, this careful, honest, competent man who dried dishes and ordered botanical books and held his father's land with quiet stubbornness, and looked at her like she was someone worth looking at. And she thought that the wrong name on a form had turned out to be the most consequential accident of her life. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He smiled then, a full and unguarded smile that she had never seen from him before because he had never let her see it. And it transformed his face in a way that made her breath catch, because it turned out that Lionel Merritt, when he was not being careful, was disarmingly beautiful. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she turned her hand to meet his, and they sat like that on the porch in the morning sun, holding on. The wedding was held on a Saturday morning in late August at the small church in Harlow Creek, with the crooked steeple. Rebecca wore a dress of pale blue cotton that she had sewn herself with fabric ordered from San Antonio, because she was not a woman who did things by halves. Clara was not able to come from Kansas City in time, but she sent a letter so warm and so funny and so full of love that Rebecca read it twice in the vestibule of the church before walking down the aisle, and carried its warmth with her through the whole ceremony. Marcos and Pete and Floyd and Curtis were all there, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good clothes, and half the town of Harlow Creek filled the pews, because it turned out that a mail-order bride who had quietly helped hold off Harlan Garrett's land grab was a person the community was interested in. The minister was a stout, kind man named Reverend Booth who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, and when he got to the part about names, he looked at the register and then at Lionel and said, "Groom's name." "Lionel Merritt," Lionel said. "Bride's name." And Rebecca said clearly, "Rebecca Hale, soon to be Rebecca Merritt." Lionel's hand tightened slightly on hers, and she felt it, the warmth of it running all the way up her arm. When the minister said they were husband and wife and Lionel turned to her and kissed her for the first time, it was careful at first, and then not careful at all, and the church made a sound that was half laughter and half something more tender, and she felt his hand on her jaw, warm and sure, and she leaned into it, and the August light came through the crooked church windows and made everything gold. They had a celebration at the ranch that afternoon, with food that Rebecca had spent the better part of 2 days preparing, assisted by the wife of the blacksmith, a broad, generous woman named Me who had taken a liking to Rebecca and come out to the ranch several times in the weeks before the wedding with gifts of preserves and practical advice, and the occasional pointed observation about Lionel's long-standing need for someone to marry him. There was food and music, because Floyd turned out to be a surprisingly accomplished fiddle player, and the ranch yard in the late afternoon was full of sound and laughter, and the particular golden quality of light that Texas did in August. And Rebecca stood at the edge of it all for one moment and looked at the man across the yard who was her husband now, who had his hat tipped back and was laughing at something Marcos had said. And she felt the fullness of it press against the inside of her ribs like something that had finally been allowed to expand. He looked over and saw her watching him and held her gaze, and across the noise and the music and the 30 feet of Texas afternoon between them, something moved between them that was entirely private. He crossed the yard to her with that unhurried, direct stride she had recognized from the very first moment, and he took her hand and said quietly, close enough that no one else could hear, "Are you happy?" She considered it honestly, the way she always considered things. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my adult life," she said, "which is surprising given how thoroughly I mishandled the paperwork." He laughed. That real and unguarded laugh that she was learning was one of her favorite sounds in the world, and he kept her hand in his and turned them both back toward the celebration. The first year of their marriage was full of the work and small discoveries that constitute a real life rather than a romantic fantasy, and it was better than any fantasy Rebecca had ever held, precisely because of its reality. She learned the deep rhythms of the ranch alongside its surface ones, the seasonal movements of the cattle, the particular demands of the Texas winter that was nothing like Missouri winters but had its own severity, the relationship between the land and the weather, between water and grass and survival. She kept the household with the same practical efficiency she had always had, but now without the grinding exhaustion of doing it alone and without recognition. Lionel was not the kind of husband who thought the work of a house was invisible. He saw it and said so, and in the evenings they often sat together in the lamplight of the sitting room while she mended or read and he worked on the ranch accounts, and the quiet between them was the deep, satisfied quiet of two people who were glad to be exactly where they were. She wrote to Clara regularly, long letters full of detail and observation, and the occasional confession that surprised even her in its honesty, and Clara's letters back were full of news about Kansas City and Thomas, and the small house they had bought, and the domestic happiness that Clara had constructed with her characteristic warmth and ease. Clara asked, in one letter in October, if Rebecca and Lionel were thinking about children, and Rebecca read the question twice, and then put the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the yard and felt something she did not quite know what to do with, a kind of wanting that was newer and more specific than the general loneliness she had carried before. She did not answer that part of Clara's letter directly. She mentioned it to Lionel that evening instead, simply and honestly, as she tried to do most things. "My sister asked whether we are thinking about children," she said. He was at the sitting room desk with his ledger, but he looked up at that and his expression was open and attentive. "What did you tell her?" "I have not answered that part yet," she said. "I wanted to talk to you first." He set down his pen. "What do you want?" he asked. She thought about it carefully. "I think I want a family," she said. "If you do, I did not come here expecting anything, but I have been here long enough now to know what I hope for." "I want that too," he said simply. "I have for a long time." She nodded once, and he looked at her with that warm and direct gaze, and she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. She wrote back to Clara the next week and told her yes. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard in ways that had nothing to do with Harlan Garrett, who had gone quiet and stayed that way. It was a cold winter, colder than the local men said it usually ran, with 2 significant ice storms that kept everyone close to the buildings for days at a time and took a toll on the cattle. They lost 8 head in January to a combination of the cold and a fast-moving sickness that Lionel and Marcos worked around the clock to contain before it spread further. Rebecca, during those long cold days, discovered the particular character of Lionel under pressure and found it exactly what she had expected and also more than she had expected. He did not panic. He did not withdraw into silence or lash out at the people around him. He worked methodically and without sleep when necessary, and he was honest with his hands about what was happening and what the stakes were, and when it was over and they had lost 8 cattle but saved the rest, he stood in the cold barn at dawn and let out a long breath and then said, "All right, that's done," and went inside and slept for 10 hours. She had kept coffee and food ready throughout those days and had helped with what she could, and when he woke from that long sleep, she had a meal waiting that was better than the occasion technically required, because she had decided early in their marriage that the occasions that were technically ordinary were often the ones that needed the most care. He ate and looked at her across the table and said, "I don't know what I did before you." "You managed," she said. "Barely," he said, and meant it. Spring came with its particular Texas extravagance, the wildflowers erupting across the pastures in waves of color, the garden leaping back to life with a vigor that rewarded her months of work, the creek running fuller and clearer on the snowmelt from the hills to the north. Rebecca found herself walking the property in those spring mornings with a sense of ownership that had taken time to fully arrive, but was now completely present. This was her land. These were her fields, her garden, her creek, her home. She had earned it not by any legal document, though the legal documents were in order, but by the daily labor of loving and tending it. She also discovered in the first week of March that she was expecting a child. She told Lionel on a Tuesday evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the supper things cleared and the lamp between them, simply and directly, the way she told him everything. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then his expression did something complex and beautiful, the controlled face opening up into something nakedly joyful, and he was across the kitchen and gathering her hands in both of his before she had finished processing the movement. "Rebecca," he said, and her name in his voice had a texture she had never heard before, something reverent and overwhelmed and happy all at once. "Are you pleased?" she asked, though she already knew. "More than I know how to say," he said, and he brought her hands to his mouth and held them there, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her fingers and the steady hold of his grip, and she thought that this was what she had been waiting for, not just in the months since the stagecoach, but in all the years before it, when she had been standing outside warm windows and not understanding that she would one day be inside. She wrote to Clara that same evening, and Clara's reply, when it came, contained a pressed flower and 3 lines of capital letters expressing various forms of delight and closed with, "I always knew that wrong name was the best thing you ever wrote." The pregnancy was healthy and unremarkable in all the ways that mattered. She stayed active through the summer and fall, working the garden and managing the household with modifications that she made without being asked, accommodating the growing heaviness of her body with a practical equanimity that her husband admired deeply and tried not to hover over too obviously. He was not, she discovered, capable of entirely hiding the hovering. He was subtle about it, but it was there, the way he was always near when she was on the ladder to reach the high kitchen shelf, the way he had quietly moved several things in the kitchen to lower locations without comment, the way he always knew where she was on the property and had a reason to be in the same general area. She mentioned this to him one evening with a smile, and he had the grace to look caught. "I just want you to be safe," he said. "I am very safe," she said. "I am also very competent." "I know both of those things," he said. "I'm still glad to be nearby." She took his hand. "Then be nearby," she said. "Just try not to look quite so much like a man waiting for disaster." He laughed, and they were all right. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a clear, cold Tuesday morning that reminded Rebecca of nothing so much as the morning she had stepped off the stagecoach in Harlow Creek, that particular crisp quality of air and light that she had come to associate with important arrivals. The birth was attended by the local midwife, a capable and unsentimental woman named Mrs. Dunbar, who had delivered half the children in the county and brooked no nonsense from either mothers or fathers. Lionel waited in the kitchen with Pete and Marcos, who had both absolutely no reason to be there, but had both arrived at dawn and refused to leave, and drank the coffee Rebecca had set up the evening before in the expectation that they would all be waiting. The baby was born just after sunrise, healthy and substantial and very loud in his first opinion of the world, and Mrs. Dunbar brought him bundled to Lionel in the kitchen doorway and said, "A boy. Everyone is well." Marcos said something in Spanish that was almost certainly an expression of deep relief. Pete said nothing, but his face said everything. And Lionel stood holding the small, red-faced bundle with the careful, astonished tenderness of a man holding the most important thing he had ever held. And Rebecca, watching from the bedroom doorway where she had been helped to rest, felt her heart expand to a size she had not known it was capable of. They named him James, after Lionel's father, with the middle name Thomas after Clara's husband, which made Clara's next letter nearly incoherent with joy. James Merritt was, from the beginning, a person of decided opinions and considerable volume, and he grew through his first year with the energetic attention of a child who understood that the world was enormous and interesting, and intended to investigate all of it at close range. By the time he was walking, which happened slightly earlier than Mrs. Dunbar had predicted and considerably earlier than either of his parents was prepared for, the ranch had acquired a new dimension. Everything had to be reconsidered from a height of approximately 30 inches. The men of the bunkhouse were collectively and comprehensively won over. Marcos, in particular, became a devoted ally of James's investigations, taking him on slow explorations of the barn and the paddock with a patience that was, Rebecca thought, the clearest evidence that Marcos would one day be a remarkable father himself. Clara came to visit in the spring of 1885, traveling by train to San Antonio and then by stagecoach to Harlow Creek, accompanied by her husband Thomas, who was a quiet, thoughtful man with round spectacles and a genuine interest in ranching that surprised everyone, including himself. Clara arrived with the same warmth and energy that Rebecca had described in all her letters, and the sight of her sister walking across the ranch yard with her arms open made Rebecca feel something in her chest that was entirely irreducible to words. They talked for 3 days almost without stopping, sitting on the porch and at the kitchen table and walking along the creek with James between them, and Clara cried at the garden and said, "You built all of this," not meaning the garden specifically but everything, the home and the life and the person Rebecca had become inside it. "We built it," Rebecca corrected, meaning herself and Lionel. Clara watched Lionel across the yard where he was working with Thomas on some fence repair that Thomas had enthusiastically volunteered for, and she looked at the ease between them and the way Lionel's face changed when he looked over at Rebecca, and she said quietly, "You know, when I first got your letter, I was afraid you had made a terrible mistake." "Going to Texas?" Rebecca asked. "Writing the wrong name," Clara said. "I was afraid it would lead to something disappointing or painful." "I should have known you better. You knew me very well," Rebecca said. "You couldn't have predicted this. I couldn't have predicted this." "No," Clara said, "but here you are." "Here I am," Rebecca agreed. In the autumn of 1885, Lionel expanded the cattle operation, adding a new section of fenced pasture to the north of the property and acquiring 30 more head, which required hiring 2 additional ranch hands and building an extension on the bunkhouse. Rebecca was part of those decisions, as she was part of all the decisions about the ranch, sitting with Lionel in the study on winter evenings going over the numbers and the plans with the same steady attention she had brought from the very beginning, when she had seen Garrett's strategy in the shape of a hand-drawn map. The ranch prospered. Not in the extravagant way of the cattle barons further south, but in the solid, reliable way of a well-run operation in good land with honest management. They were comfortable. They were stable. They were home. She discovered she was expecting again in January of 1886, and when she told Lionel, his response was immediate and uncomplicated. He pulled her into his arms in the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon and held her there for a long time, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed the particular smell of him, cedar and leather and cold air, and felt perfectly and entirely content. Their second child was born in September of 1886, a daughter they named Eleanor, after Rebecca's mother. Eleanor was her father's daughter in the early months, quiet and watchful and serious, with a gaze that seemed to be making careful assessments of everything it landed on. And James, aged 2.5 and already a force of nature, regarded her with an expression that cycled through suspicion, interest, and finally a proprietary protectiveness that made the whole household laugh. Marcos, by this time, had fallen in love with a young woman from Harlow Creek named Rosa, the daughter of a Mexican-American family who ran a small farm to the south. And Lionel gave him a month of leave for his wedding, and then gave him a raise when he came back, because good men were hard to find, and Marcos was one of the best. Pete had retired the previous spring to a small property near his daughter's home in central Texas, and they had seen him off with a dinner that was, Rebecca privately considered, one of the better ones she had ever cooked. The years settled into their own particular beauty, not the static beauty of a painting, but the living, changing beauty of something growing and adapting and enduring. James grew into a child who was at various turns exhausting and hilarious and genuinely fascinating, who asked questions at a rate that could reduce adults to honest bafflement, who followed his father everywhere with the focused intensity of a student determined to master the curriculum. Eleanor grew into a small, serious person who appeared to find the world full of things worthy of careful study, who had a gift for sitting very still and observing things, who was, by the age of 2, capable of a look that reminded Rebecca startlingly of herself. Lionel watched his daughter deliver this look to a visitor one afternoon and then turned to Rebecca with his brow raised, and she said, "Do not look at me like that," which made him laugh in the way she loved best. The spring of 1888 brought an occasion that Rebecca had thought about for some time, without knowing quite what to do with. She and Lionel had been married nearly 6 years, and she was sitting one May evening on the porch with Eleanor on her lap and James somewhere in the barn with Marcos, and Lionel was beside her in the other chair with his hat off and his boots up on the porch railing, and the sunset was doing extravagant things to the Texas sky, all orange and rose and deep violet in the higher registers, and she said, without particular preamble, "I never sent the letter back to the agency." He looked at her. "When I first arrived," she said, "I was going to tell the agency about the name error and formally withdraw. I never did. I kept meaning to, and then things moved quickly and it got pushed aside." "Does it matter now?" he asked. "Not legally," she said. "We are legally married under my correct name. It has never mattered in any practical sense. I just think about it sometimes. The chain of accidents that led to all of this." "The wrong name," he said. "The wrong name," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and the sunset continued its extravagance, and Eleanor pointed at a swallow crossing the yard and said her emphatic, imprecise version of the word bird, and Lionel looked from his daughter to his wife and said, "I used to wonder sometimes, in the months after I sent in my request to the agency, whether anyone would actually come. It seemed unlikely that a woman who had real choices would choose to come to West Texas and marry a man she had never met based on a letter. And," she said, "and then you stepped off that stagecoach and told me the truth in the first 30 seconds, and I thought, well, that's either very foolish or very brave, and after about 2 days I had decided it was brave." She looked at him in the settling evening light, this man who was her husband, who had said, "Stay anyway," when she had given him every reasonable reason not to, who had built a life with her with the same quality of honest attention he brought to everything, who had watched her grow into this landscape, and had grown alongside her. And she thought that she would spend a very long time being grateful for one moment of candle-lit distraction in her aunt's narrow kitchen in Kansas City. "I think it was mostly foolish," she said, "and that it worked out anyway. Best kind of story," he said. She shifted a leaner on her lap and reached across the space between their chairs, and he took her hand in his without looking, the automatic, easy certainty of two people who had been reaching for each other long enough that it required no thought. James came running from the barn at that moment with a new grievance about something Marcos had told him he couldn't do, and the quiet evening broke apart into the noise of a family going about its ordinary and beloved life, and Rebecca held a leaner and listened to her son, and watched her husband talk the small drama of the barn down to manageable proportions, and felt the fullness of it all the way to the edges of herself. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow in the steady, unspectacular way that suited them both. Lionel negotiated a partnership with a neighboring rancher to the west, a decent man named Cowboy who had been in the county for 30 years, and whose cattle operation complemented the Merritt spread in useful ways. They worked together during the difficult drives to the Carlisle market, and shared the cost of a new water tank that benefited both properties. And the arrangement was everything that land dealings in the county should have been and so rarely were. Harlan Garrett sold his land in 1889 to a cattle syndicate and moved east, and the entire county breathed a collective sigh. Rebecca heard about it from me at the general store and went home and told Lionel, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good," in the flat, final way that closed the subject entirely. The children grew. James at 7 was tall and curious and determined, already riding well and full of opinions about the cattle that were sometimes entirely correct, which Marcos found privately hilarious. Alina at 5 was beginning to show a patience with the garden that reminded everyone who knew her of her mother at a young age, and she would sit for extraordinary lengths of time in the garden, Rose watching insects or studying leaves, with a concentration that was completely her own. Clara and Thomas came to visit again in the summer of 1890, and this time they brought their own 2 children, a boy named Patrick and a girl named Rose, and the ranch yard became for 2 weeks a chaos of children and adults and animals that Rebecca would remember for the rest of her life as one of the finest things she had ever witnessed. Clara sat with her on the porch every evening, and they talked the way they had always talked, without armor or performance, just 2 sisters who had found their respective ways to happiness by entirely different roads. "Are you ever sorry?" Clara asked one evening, with the directness that had always been between them. Rebecca looked out at the ranch in the long summer evening, at the yard and the barn and the garden and the paddock and the open range beyond the fence stretching to the darkening horizon, and she thought about the wrong name on a form and the stagecoach and the enormous sky and a man who had said stay. "Not for one moment," she said. Clara took her hand. "Good," she said. "You deserve this. We both do," Rebecca said. Lionel found her a little later, sitting alone on the porch steps after Clara had gone inside to put the children to bed, and he sat down beside her in the warm evening dark and said nothing, just sat close, his shoulder against hers, and they looked at the stars that were beginning to appear in the Texas sky, which showed more stars than any other sky Rebecca had ever known, as though the enormous open landscape demanded an equally enormous and open dark to match it. "I love you," she said, because she thought it deserved to be said out loud in the dark and not assumed. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was exactly what it had always been, honest and direct and entirely itself. "I love you," he said. "I have since somewhere around the 3rd day you were here, maybe the 2nd. She laughed, soft and warm. "That seems fast." "It was fast," he agreed. You kept doing things that made it hard to be cautious about. Like what? Like telling the truth when you didn't have to, he said. Like fixing the garden without being asked. Like understanding what Garrett was doing with the water. He paused. Like looking at this place like it was worth looking at. She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the solid, warm weight of him beside her and the vast, star-filled night above them, and thought that of all the accidents and decisions and small moments of inattention that had made up the chain of her life, the wrong name written by candlelight in her aunt's narrow kitchen was the one she would keep above all others. She had come to Texas as Clara and had stayed as herself, and the man she had stayed for had known from the beginning which was the right one to have. In the autumn of 1891, on a morning not unlike the one she had arrived on 9 years before, Rebecca stood in the garden she had built from neglect and turned earth, and cleared it for the season with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew the land under her hands as well as she knew her own face. Eleanor was beside her, small and serious, carefully putting the last of the dried bean pods into the basket the way Rebecca had shown her, and James was somewhere near the barn with his father, the sound of their voices carrying across the yard in the clear morning air, Lionel's low and measured, James's quicker and more emphatic, talking about horses the way both of them loved too. She straightened and looked out over the property, at the fence lines and the pastures and the water tank and the barn and the house with its covered porch, at all of it solid and real and hers, and she felt the particular quality of happiness that is not excitement or novelty, but something slower and deeper, the happiness of a life that is genuinely what you built it to be. James called something to her across the yard, something about a horse's shoe that had caught his father's attention, and she called back that she had heard him, and Lionel looked over and met her eyes across the width of the yard in the morning, and held them for a moment with that look of his, the one she had learned to read in all its variations over 9 years of mornings, and this one said, simply and completely, that he was glad she was there. She lifted her hand to him, and he lifted his hat in return, and Eleanor tugged her sleeve and pointed at a particularly fine specimen of dried bean pod that she felt deserved attention, and Rebecca bent down to look at it, and agreed that it was indeed the best one, and the morning went on around them, warm and full of small sounds and the smell of cedar and earth, the ordinary and perfect life of two people who had found each other by accident and stayed by choice. Building something real in the wide, generous, demanding Texas land. The wrong name on a form had been, in the end, the most exactly right thing she had ever written. And the man who had said stay anyway had meant it in every way there was to mean a thing, not just for that first uncertain afternoon in front of the general store, but for every morning after and every evening, and every year stacked quietly on the one before it, adding up to something that could only be called, without any irony or qualification, a good and happy life. She picked up her basket and took her daughter's hand and walked back across the garden toward the house, and the Texas sky was enormous and clear above her, and somewhere a meadowlark was singing from the fence post, and the sound of her husband and her son talking about horses followed her across the yard like something she had always known was there, steady and warm and entirely her own.